Hello and welcome everyone. This is Daryl Kimball. I'm Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. And I want to welcome everybody to today's event on the challenges, implications, and risk reduction options regarding China's nuclear expansion. For decades, the United States has been worried about China's regional influence, its military activities, and its nuclear potential. And now as US-China tensions have grown and Beijing has bolstered its military capabilities, there is even more worry. According to US officials, there's a real possibility that in a regional crisis, China could escalate quickly in the conflict to using nuclear weapons. And that's one reason why President Biden brought up the issue of nuclear risk reduction with President Xi in their recent virtual summit. And of course, earlier this month, the Defense Department's annual China military power report confirmed what earlier government statements and independent experts have revealed about China's nuclear activity, which is that China appears to be on the cusp of a very significant and very concerning nuclear weapons buildup that exceeds earlier projections. That Pentagon report also highlighted China's apparent plans to expand the size and diversity of its arsenal, including hundreds, possibly hundreds of new land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles and the possibility of increasing the readiness of its nuclear forces. Now, the United States nuclear arsenal is, of course, 10 times larger than that of China, but China's nuclear arsenal at some 300 nuclear weapons, including probably over 100 strategic warheads, is still extremely deadly. And like the United States and Russia, the United States and China are both locked in a dangerous state of mutual nuclear vulnerability. So the factors driving this buildup are not clear. We'll explore some of those questions and issues today. And whether China implements this buildup may depend in the next several years on what the United States and other countries do in response. So in the view of the Arms Control Association, China's advances in the increasingly competitive relationship with the United States make it all the more important that Beijing and Washington agree to engage in a meaningful dialogue on risk reduction and arms control. And the question right now, among others, is how do we do that? How does the United States and China head off unconstrained nuclear weapons competition in the years ahead? So we have with us today three very well-informed and thoughtful speakers to explore these and other questions. And first, we're going to hear from Gerald Brown, who's an analyst with Valiant Integrated Services, and he's going to focus on the factors that might be driving China to augment its nuclear capabilities. He's going to offer his thoughts about what this potential nuclear force buildup means for stability in the region. And I just note that he wrote recently a piece in Arms Control Today in the June 2021 issue on the subject titled Understanding the Risks and Realities of China's Nuclear Forces. Next, we're going to hear from Lynn Ruston, who is Vice President of the Global Nuclear Policy Program at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Lynn has held a number of senior positions, too many to mention all at once, but at the White House, Department of State, and Congress dealing with nuclear arms control and nonproliferation and national security. And she's going to be discussing the implications of China's nuclear advances for US nuclear force posture decisions. The United States, of course, the Biden administration is in the middle of a nuclear posture review due to be out sometime early next year. And last but not least, we will hear from former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security and our friend here at the Arms Control Association, Rose Gottemoeller, who, among other things, is or was the lead negotiator for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and I should add, is the author of a tidy and well done new book on the subject that I recommend everybody take a look at. So Rose is going to discuss the importance of dialogue and engagement with China on nuclear risk reduction and arms control. She's going to offer her suggestions based on her experience about how the two sides can get that process started. And once they do, and if they do, what options might be pursued with China. There's a great deal of interest on both sides of the aisle here in Washington about that, but there so far has been very little concrete suggestions about what exactly the United States might offer to China and what China might be able to do to address US concerns. So after each of them speaks for maybe 12 minutes or so, we're going to have Q&A with all of you, and we have a good number of people on the line. And let me just note before I turn this over to Gerald that if you can please send your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll get to as many as possible. And we're going to try to wrap up. Jerry, if you could unmute yourself. No later than 3:30 p.m. Thank you for Eastern joining us. This afternoon. We appreciate you being with us. And the virtual floor is now yours. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Daryl. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, especially so many phenomenal thinkers in the field on the panel today. Before I go any further, I think I'm obligated to point out real quick, nothing I say represents my employers or clients or anything of the sort. Any views expressed today are just my own. So on Chinese nuclear weapons, so I think the easiest way to summarize China's historic approach to nuclear strategy is what we would summarize maybe as called assured retaliation. The basic premise of this is that you maintain a capacity to retaliate against an adversary with enough pain to make it so they don't find it worthwhile doing in the first place. China's view of nuclear weapons evolved substantially different than that of states like the US or the Soviet Union. They often viewed nukes as rather unusable or incredible, and instead put a more into the conventional weapons. They thought that conventional conflicts would ultimately be where wars were won or were lost. So with this, nuclear weapons kind of came about to deter nuclear attack and prevent an adversary's nuclear coercion. Authoritative texts on Chinese military thinking really describe three major missions. In peacetime, they would seek to deter an enemy from launching a nuclear war as China. In wartime, constrain the scope of escalation and prevent conventional conflict from escalating to a nuclear exchange. And if war were to occur to a nuclear war, then they would serve to conduct nuclear counterattacks. So kind of together and coupled with their conventional strategy, we could view it as seeking to check nuclear use by an adversary and instead win wars at lower conventional levels of escalation. But Chinese nuclear forces have changed quite a bit in the past several years here. So some of the things that have been going, there have been a lot of along like qualitative and quantitative lines of effort. Some things such as proliferation of accurate theater range systems, such as the DF-21 and the DF-26. Some of these, such as DF-26, can also switch between conventional and nuclear payloads in the field, which makes it considerably more concerning, at least in my mind. Also, there have been a lot of shifts towards development of a nuclear triad. I think these lines of effort have been primarily like oriented towards the qualitative benefits, but by necessity, they also necessitate a quantitative increase. So for instance, there is the expansion, the development of the H-20 stealth bomber, along with an air-launched ballistic missile to accompany that. Additionally, we have seen proliferation of sea-based systems, such as the Type 96 SSBN, and then also they've been still fielding more numbers, the Type 94s, and building the JO3 to go along with that. Some things that have just in the past few months here that have really kind of like flipped the situation a little bit are the discovery of the ICBM silo fields that were picked up. Though there was 3 new silo fields discovered, with totaling over 300 new ICBMs. So such a vast expansion in Chinese nuclear abilities. DoD recently changed its assessment to say that they believe there'd be up to 1,000 Chinese nuclear weapons by the end of the decade. So definitely a substantial shift from the kind of historic approach of a very small and limited arsenal, which raises the question that's on everyone's mind is why, right? And there's a lot of open questions here. The Communist Party has not exactly put out a nice press statement or a nuclear posture review on what they're doing and why. But evaluating the Chinese discourse on nuclear weapons gives us a lot of insight into the matter and can help us put some of the pieces together, at least. To start, I haven't really seen any evidence that China seeks to defeat the U.S. in a nuclear war or launch a bolt from blue strike. I believe that's an incorrect assessment on Chinese views of nuclear weapons. But this doesn't necessarily make it any less concerning. And there's a few factors that I think really kind of factor into this equation. So for one, I think there's definitely an element of national power and prestige. the development and creation of a world-class military and expanding and developing its nuclear forces makes a lot of sense along with the other components of the People's Liberation Army. Further, I think China really seeks to ensure that it can execute its nuclear strategy effectively, especially in the face of a increasingly tumultuous and threat environment. The PLA has long assessed that the nuclear forces may be a little more vulnerable than it likes to be. And as the threat environment changes and this question takes on increased significance. And there's a few different factors here. So I think one of the big ones has been vulnerability to not only nuclear arms, but also conventional arms. So if you're vulnerable to conventional arms and something like building silos, it makes a lot of sense. For one, they're hardened, makes it substantially more challenging to attack with conventional weapons. And further, they are outside the range of most US conventional PGMs. There's a matter of numbers, more weapons in general with nuclear or conventional arms. Even with nuclear arms, you're looking at 3 to 1 targeting ratio. So having an increased amount of nuclear weapons makes it harder to go over and be able to eliminate that and make yourself more vulnerable, right? Another aspect has been that we've seen repeatedly concerned about is vulnerability to U.S. missile defense. I think most people here know that U.S. missile defense probably doesn't work that well, right? And the purpose of it has always been like oriented towards the North Korea and threats along those lines. But you also don't plan against the potential, you plan against the worst case scenario. And if you have a very limited Chinese arsenal, we're looking at it from their view. There's a lot of concern like, okay, well, if the US does initiate a first strike and we only have so many weapons to retaliate with, then can that be mopped up? The very few remaining that we hit with, can that be mopped up by missile defense? And how did this undermine our capacity to check US nuclear use? How did the US perceive it? There's a lot of real concerns here. So with that, these changes, and so there's a lot of other potential future changes can facilitate too. Something that I've been worried about especially regards to the expansion of silos, is a Chinese shift to launch on warning. Something that Chinese strategists have talked about. Just saw it in the text such as Science and Military Strategy and other kind of discussions. It's been talked about for quite a little while now. Which if you're concerned about vulnerability and you want to make sure that you can check an adversary's nuclear use, especially in light of a conventional strategy, then making sure that you can launch your weapons before they're hit in the first place, that vastly increases survivability, right? The recent DoD report that you mentioned also highlights that they've launched at least one early warning satellite, which is a capability they've been developing alongside help from Russia for quite a while now. And there's likely more to come. Launch on warning is obviously, this is still somewhat speculative, but there's definitely a real risk that at least part of their force could switch to such a posture, which Chinese strategists perceive would be in alignment with their more minimum assured retaliatory stance. So on this, we see there's a lot of important implications for the region that I think we should pay attention to. To start, I don't think that the implications start at necessarily the nuclear level all the times. I believe there is sometimes a tendency to look past the conventional side of the equation when evaluating nuclear issues. And I believe that approach is flawed. Nuclear weapons are another tool of national power and military forces to achieve the goals of the state, and they do not necessarily exist in a vacuum. Our jobs don't get to be that easy, unfortunately. So what really concerned me on the regional side is the conventional implications of a stronger Chinese nuclear arsenal and a more sophisticated Chinese nuclear arsenal. I think political scientists would call this the stability instability paradox, right? In which that if China feels more secure with its nuclear retaliatory capability and that it holds a credible capacity based on these qualitative and quantitative improvements to make it so that it can cause damage to the United States isn't willing to bear, really truly assured retaliatory capability, then it can truly check U.S. nuclear use and prevent U.S. nuclear coercion, then China may feel far more secure about engaging in regional conventional conflicts that it has been modernizing the PLA to undertake. And when you look at the route of PLA modernization, the conventional side changes in, for instance, development of joint theater commands in 2015, and just vast expansion throughout PLA naval forces, conventional missile, things along those lines, and that gets more concerning, especially considering the strange regional dynamics there where people have different views of what the status quo is or should be. Particularly here, the PLA seeks to prevent the U.S. from intervening in local wars that it's oriented itself towards. Then the risk calculus may be perceived as different, right? The PLA likely assesses that the United States would not risk a nuclear exchange for a war outside its shores, right? So with this more assured retaliatory capability and with clear conventional goals in the region, risks for conflict do escalate substantially. There's a few different ways this cuts, right? For one, conventional forces may be the more important factor in deterring conflict in the region. Just building more nuclear weapons isn't likely to really change this if they have pretty definitively assured retaliatory capability. But this really cuts both ways in that conventional conflict, I don't think that there's really a risk of a bolt from blue attack, but conventional conflict carries substantial risk of nuclear escalation. So if the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army feel more confident in executing a conventional campaign in the region, this substantially raises nuclear risks. There's also other risks here, which would be proliferation risks. As nuclear forces become more prominent in the region and tensions rise, some of our allies and partners in the region may feel inclined to, or not even necessarily our allies partners, but other just countries throughout the region, the risks of proliferation do rise as states seek to ensure their own security, which is something that I think needs to be looked at quite closely as this period moves forward. And finally, one last thing that I'll kind of leave with here is I think that a lot of this is vulnerability driven, but as China's nuclear forces do expand, new options for how their nuclear forces could be employed will become open to the People's Republic of China. And these have to be considered by analysts as well, even if these options were not necessarily the intent behind such expansions initially. But with that, I think I've prattled on long enough. Daryl, I will turn it back over to you. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, thanks a lot, Gerald. That was a great opening. And just one question that we'll come back to in the Q&A relates to one of the reasons why the reason why the Pentagon is assessing that the Chinese arsenal might rise to as much as 1,000 by the end of the decade, and whether and how that involves the two reprocessing plants that are under construction in China. But we'll come back to that in the Q&A. Next, we're going to hear from Lynn Ruston, who, as I said before, is VP for Global Nuclear Policy Programs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So, Lynn, thanks a lot for being with us once again.
Thanks so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Jerry and Rose. I've already learned something in the first 15 minutes, so that's great. So as Daryl said, I'm going to offer some thoughts about how China might be addressed in the NPR. And we know that this is already a hot topic of considerable debate within the administration right now. And of course, the debate about China takes place in the context of the broader context of articulating the Biden administration's nuclear policies. I think it's essential that the NPR clearly reflect the president's longstanding commitment to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, reinforce the NPT commitment to work toward disarmament, and embrace the goals of strategic stability and nuclear risk reduction with Russia and with China. And clearly, as we just heard from Jerry, China is growing and diversifying its nuclear forces in a way that is a significant departure from the past. The United States should pursue a response that is both responsible, but also restrained. We need to deter China from ever using nuclear weapons, but shouldn't overreact or add fuel to an escalating nuclear arms race. As was true with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, our response to China must have a military and a diplomatic component. It cannot be purely military. And was also true during the Cold War. It's the US that's going to need to set the agenda for nuclear threat reduction with China. So as Jerry just said, the DoD estimate, I'm going to talk first about military implications and US requirements. And so the projection now is that China could have 700 nuclear warheads by 2027 and possibly 1,000 by 2030. And they're also, as we heard, building several hundred ICBM silos. While this represents a significant expansion of China's current force, it will take place over the next 5 to 10 or possibly more years, at which China will still be far from parity with the United States and Russia. That means there's time for diplomacy to possibly affect China's plans, or at least embed them in greater transparency, limits, and verification, as well as to respond to unanticipated developments. Meanwhile, today, Russia, our only nuclear peer by far, is still the primary driver of US nuclear requirements. The sole remaining limits on nuclear arsenal, we know, is the New START treaty that's going to expire in 2026. And so, in my view, it remains in the US interest to retain beyond 2026 limits on Russia's strategic nuclear forces, to include also the new kinds of strategic systems that are currently not covered by New START, as well as the total stockpile of warheads, which is the probably best way to start bounding the Russian non-strategic nuclear warhead issue. To inform the US negotiating positions with Russia, the NPR is going to need to consider how much and what kind of hedge may be needed to account for the potential growth of China's nuclear forces over the life of any new successor US-Russia agreement, which I assume would have a duration of 10 years, so through 2026. To my mind, under any circumstances, at a minimum, it will be in the US interest to keep Russia constrained at least to New START levels. It may be because of uncertainties with China that the NPR decides to put greater precedence over expanding Russia's nuclear systems that will come under limits as a higher priority than seeking significantly deeper bilateral strategic reductions. But even so, a successor bilateral agreement to START is not only important for our security, in my view, but it's going to help set the stage for multilateral negotiations and limitations with China in the future, because pursuing a trilateral agreement now is just completely infeasible and unrealistic. So if there are voices, and I don't know if there are, making the argument in the government that China's nuclear capabilities now or over the next 10 to 15 years should call into question the United States' willingness to remain at New START levels with Russia, I think these arguments should be subjected to very careful scrutiny and, frankly, skepticism by our senior leaders and the president, because any policy reaction to China that leads to Russia having more strategic nuclear weapons than it does under New START, because the United States thinks it needs more, would not serve our national security. So let me turn briefly to diplomatic goals and response. I think it's critical that the NPR communicate the US intent to pursue dialogue with China in diplomatic and military channels to increase understanding of each side's plans and intentions, including all the activities Jerry just outlined that China is undertaking, to reduce the risk of military incidents, conflict, and the potential for nuclear use, and to enhance strategic stability. I think the diplomatic response is at least as important as our military response, if not more so. And the NPR and other interagency processes are going to need to identify objectives for this nuclear diplomacy with China to include realistic US goals and potentially achievable outcomes in the areas of transparency, risk reduction, stability, and in the longer term goals for nuclear arms limitations. I think that the NPR should clearly state that US missile defenses are not intended to undermine China's strategic nuclear deterrent. I note that the recently discovered Trump NPR, I'm sorry, employment guidance actually says that quite clearly. And it's, as a matter of fact, I mean, the United States is already in a position of nuclear vulnerability with China. That's not new. We haven't acknowledged this publicly. It may be time to do that explicitly. And so in sum, I think the NPR needs to articulate and enable the US intention to pursue several different tracks at once. First is prolonging and extending limitations and reductions on the Russian nuclear arsenal beyond 2026 through bilateral agreements. Second, in the near term, pursuing a process of serious dialogue and confidence building measures with China on strategic stability and risk reduction. Third, in the longer term, preparing to bring China into a nuclear arms control process, most likely after the next round of reductions with China. And last, prudently hedge for the worst case contingency that China continues to grow its nuclear forces and resist meaningful dialogue, risk reduction measures, and engagement on arms control. So really, the NPR should reflect both that the US has a sufficient deterrent now against Russia and China, and two, that the US will pursue policies and diplomacy aimed at reducing the role and number of nuclear weapons and reversing the growing risk that they will be used. So with that, I look forward to hearing Rose's thoughts on how to get traction with China on the diplomatic track.
Great, thanks so much, Lynn. That's an important analysis of how this relates to ongoing decisions about US policy. And so without further ado, I want to invite Rose to offer her thoughts about how we can address this through diplomacy and soft power and smarts. Thanks for being with us, Rose.
Thank you so much, Daryl. And wow, what great presentations for both Gerald and Lynn, really thought-provoking. And I couldn't agree more, Lynn, that we really need to be thinking hard about the potential for diplomacy to serve our purposes very well at this moment. And so that is what I'd like to talk about in my presentation today, very briefly, and really riffing off what we've learned in recent days about the Biden-Xi meeting and the outcome there, at least with regard to nuclear stability. First, I would like to reemphasize a point that both Gerald and Lynn made, and that is there is no need to panic. I always think about it in a very simple way. That is, the United States has over 4,000 warheads in its arsenal, 1,550 of which are operationally deployed under the limits of the New START Treaty. Even if the Chinese do quadruple their force of their nuclear warhead force, they will end up with an estimated 1,000 warheads. They have a long way to go to catch up with the United States, and I welcome that message very much present in both Lynn and Gerald's presentations, but it's worth repeating because there tends, I think, to be a bit of panic in some of the discussions I've heard among experts on these issues. We have time for a serious discussion of nuclear stability issues, and we should use that time to understand each other's nuclear strategy and force posture and to avoid a nuclear arms race. The last thing we want to do is repeat the experience of the Cold War, when the United States built over 32,000 warheads and the USSR over 40,000. We created a nuclear impasse that was expensive and destabilizing. It almost ended in a nuclear holocaust during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, with new technologies driving the risk of escalation, we could end up in a worse situation with China if we are not careful. The United States and Russia have unique experience to inform this situation, since they have been working together ever since Cuba to prevent new nuclear crises of that magnitude. Indeed, as Jake Sullivan stressed in his briefing following the Biden-Xi meeting, he said, with Russia, we have a formal strategic stability dialogue that is far more mature with a deeper history to it. That history, in my view, can and should be mined for lessons to guide strategic stability talks with China. One lesson is to avoid attempts to limit new technology. The US and USSR tried to go down this route in the first Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, SALT I, freezing deployment of new missiles. The USSR got out from under that freeze by deploying multiple warheads on top of ground-launched missiles, the so-called Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicles, or MIRVs. Although many in the United States cried foul at the time at this development, before too long, the United States had deployed MIRVs on highly accurate submarine-launched missiles. Not only could these missiles reliably hit their targets, but they could do so from platforms concealed in the deep ocean. They could survive a surprise first strike to launch retaliation. From this experience, it became clear that attempts to limit technology would be difficult to pull off. Instead, the US and USSR came around to the notion that nuclear weapons should be controlled and reduced. Controlling weapons has a host of meanings, both operational, such as constraining where they are deployed, and numerical, such as setting a cap on missiles and warheads. It also has an element of verification to it. One Russian word for verification is control, ensuring that measures agreed to are being implemented. Reduction is self-evident, reducing deployed numbers of missiles, delivery vehicles, that is, and the systems that launch them, their launchers, as well as warheads. Such reductions, of course, must also be effectively verified. Control and reduction may sound like straightforward goals, but it took both countries over a decade to agree that course. Verification involving on-site inspection was always difficult for the Soviet Union, and reductions were not very popular in either the Russian General Staff or the Pentagon. It was not until President Reagan and President Gorbachev met at Reykjavik in 1986 that our two countries began to take deep reductions in nuclear weapons seriously, which leads us to the second lesson for the Chinese strategic stability process. Patience will be key. I do not want to imply, however, that we will need to repeat the years of effort that it took in the US-Russia case. We have too much experience of nuclear diplomacy, even with the Chinese, to necessitate that course. The Obama administration carried on multiple strategic stability tracks with Beijing, including at the military-to-military level, and China participates in a number of international conventions and regimes, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Thus, it should be possible to make faster progress with China than was the case in the old days with the Soviet Union. I think Russia can help in this regard through its own ability to have stability discussions with the Chinese. It will not be possible, nor would be particularly desirable to sit down to a trilateral strategic stability discussion, China, Russia, and the United States. Our bilateral agenda with Russia is far advanced, despite our troubled relationship, with a working group already in train to pursue a follow-on treaty to New START. A second working group will tackle technological issues affecting the strategic balance, or what Russia calls the new strategic equation. By contrast, the agenda with China is still to be defined, but we should not expect the Chinese to jump into nuclear reduction negotiations. Again, Lynn has made this point. According to media reports, US officials acknowledged that fact in the wake of the Biden-Xi conversation, saying that a formal arms control negotiation is not a realistic goal because Beijing wouldn't accept limits on its nuclear arsenal unless it was closer to parity with Washington and Moscow. And I do not think, as a matter of policy, we should be encouraging China to race to parity with Washington and Moscow. Instead, I expect a broad-ranging stability agenda from traditional nuclear strategy, doctrine, and force posture discussions. And indeed, if we are to avoid an arms race, we truly need to understand more about China's objectives with regard to its nuclear modernization. I can also see an extensive agenda on the implications of new technology. For example, the danger of cyber attacks on nuclear command and control, the new attention to space-based assets and missile defense developments, especially in the wake of the FOBS test, the so-called fractional orbital bombardment vehicle system from the summer that was on the Chinese side, and the new Russian ASAT test just this week. And implications of hypersonic missile deployments. I want to stress that I'm only speculating. I have no insider information about what will be on the agenda, but I have heard concerns voiced in second track meetings by Chinese experts, and these issues that I've just enumerated as examples are among those that they frequently raise. I will just say again that I think we, as difficult as it's going to be, we and Russia are going to have to work together on this. I, along with some of my colleagues, have been urging Russia to be conducting a parallel conversation in a strategic stability setting with the Chinese, that both of us should be working, if not together in the same process, at least in parallel, to try to understand better China's objectives, and also then to be communicating among ourselves, of course, with complete transparency with Beijing as we come to understand more and more about their point of view. So is this realistic? Well, I think it's a question for our Russian colleagues to answer as well. But I do understand in recent years there have been some strategic stability dialogues between Moscow and Beijing, so that a start has already been made in that regard. And perhaps we can bring our two processes close together. I would like to see that happen, if only once again to facilitate mutual understanding among first Beijing, Moscow, and Washington, but in the end of the day, among the whole NPT community. And just to close, I'll remark that I think it's interesting. We have an NPT Review Conference coming up in January, from January 4th until the 23rd. The P5, the nuclear weapon states under the NPT, are going to have to get together to discuss how they're going to present their continued commitment to the disarmament pillar of the NPT at that meeting in January. Will be interesting to know what exactly the NPT preparations will look like among the P5. I wish I could be a fly on the wall for those discussions. So thank you, Gerald, very, very much. I look forward to the question and answer period and our further discussions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rose. All very wise words of wisdom for this difficult situation. We have a good number of questions pouring in here. I just want to ask everyone's patience, to use one of Rose's watchwords, as we try to get to as many of these as possible. And I just wanted to start with a simple one. I wanted to ask each of you to take a stab at answering this. I think some of you kind of touched on this indirectly, but Valeria Hess is asking, and I think it's a good question, why do we think China is pursuing these capabilities, especially the ballistic missile silos that seem to be under construction now? What may have been the trigger, or is it not so sudden? So quick answers, maybe Rose, if you want to take a crack at that, and then Lynn and then Jerry.
I think we have to remain alert to the possibility that China, of course, could fill every one of those silos with ICBMs. But with my recollection of the Soviet nuclear arsenal development throughout the 50s and 60s, I'm very much remembering the missile gap period and the whole shell game situation from the 50s and 60s. And I'm thinking there may be an element of that. I'm not alone in that speculation. Other experts have made the same point, but I am very clearly remembering that Soviet history when they were trying to convey that they had more than they actually had, number one, and number two, to really complicate U.S. targeting.
Okay. Lynn, your thoughts?
I assume it's for survivability, assured second strike, and I was noted Jerry's observation that those silos are out of range of, I guess, ship-based systems. Is that right? So I'd say survivability, and it's their hedge.
So Jerry, why is this happening now? I mean, what may have been the precipitating factors for the Chinese regarding whatever they are doing?
Yeah, no, I think that's all right. And there's a panel. First, it's obviously been being undertaken for a little while. These plans don't pop up overnight, right? But there is largely a component of PLA modernization overall, as China seeks to create a world-class military, modernization by 2035 and world-class military by 2049, right? This is definitely a component of it, but there is really that concern of vulnerability. And especially as tensions do raise in the region, this question is going to be more and more pressing on the mind of PLA planners.
All right. So let me come back to some of the questions that are coming in, and I wanted to get to there are a couple relating to the basis for what might be the basis for the Pentagon China Military Power Report's projection assessment that China could possibly build as many as 1,000 warheads by the end of the decade. Stephanie Cook notes, and others have noted, that China is building 2 reprocessing plants. Reprocessing plants, for those of you who are not nuclear engineers, they separate plutonium from spent fuel. That can be theoretically used for civilian purposes, not particularly good for civilian nuclear power, but it can also be used to separate plutonium for weapons. How do we know anything, Jerry or Lynn, Rose, about whether China has made a decision to utilize those facilities? And I ask this because as I read the Pentagon report, it's clear that their assessment is quite speculative. And we don't know if China is actually going to do this, and it would take constructing those plants and using them for military purposes. So Jerry, your thoughts on that, please.
Sure. And I think that's right. There is definitely a level of speculation there. But it is a possibility, right? One of the biggest constraints on a Chinese nuclear breakout, so to speak, is the lack of fissile material stores to actually build and develop weapons. But that could change, right? Obviously, China has built fissile material in the past. They can do it again, and this could facilitate that. But there is definitely a level of we don't know at this point.
Lynn or Rose, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one thing I took note of when I was undersecretary was the change in in Chinese policy at the Conference on Disarmament regarding a fissile material cutoff treaty. For part of my time in that position, and it was a very frustrating period. Many of you know that Pakistan has blocked the fissile material cutoff treaty negotiations getting started in the CD now for many, many years. It's a decade or more at this point. But we were looking for ways early in the previous decade, 2010, 11, to get things started. And at that time, China was seemingly fully on board, although they may even at that point have been hiding behind Pakistan. But within a year or two, they had changed their formal rhetoric to not be at all enthusiastic about the fissile material cutoff treaty for the reason they said they may need more fissile material. So although I don't know the answer to Stephanie's question, it does seem in policy terms that they were signaling even a decade ago that they had need of more fissile material for whatever purpose.
All right. Any further thoughts, Lynn?
No, I have nothing to add on this.
Okay. We have a question from Rishi Kapoor, who's a NATO policy officer. That's a good one. And since we have the former NATO Deputy Secretary General with us, it would be remiss if I didn't get this one in there. Rishi asks, what implications does China's nuclear modernization program pose for allies in the region and NATO? We've heard NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg talk about China also, but last I checked, China was in Asia, NATO was in Europe. I mean, what are the implications for NATO and the US allies in the Asia region, in your view, Rose?
Certainly for the allies in the region, for the ROK, for Japan, Australia, New Zealand, there's a necessity. Again, this is more for the ROK and Japan, but the extended deterrence commitments of the United States need to be both well understood by all parties, including the Chinese, but they also need to be solid and serious. And so, as in the NATO case, when there are questions raised about the U.S. extended deterrence commitments, the allies get nervous. So I think it will behoove the United States to reiterate those commitments in the Asia, Indo-Pacific, and to be ready to be very open and clear with allies. We haven't brought up the whole debate over declaratory policy yet today, but I know, just having spent a week at NATO 2 weeks ago, and from what I hear from Asia allies as well, they're very, very nervous about any switch in US declaratory policy now. So it will really be important for the United States moving through this NPR process and the review of declaratory policy to be in close touch with the allies at every turn to continue to underscore the seriousness and solidity of the US extended deterrence commitments. As far as the other implications for NATO allies, NATO is undergoing now a redo of its strategic concept. The last one was done in 2010 when Europe was, quote, at peace, and Russia was a close partner of the NATO alliance. So now they are taking a new look at the strategic concept. And one new factor will be how China is treated in that strategic concept. The language from the London summit in 2019 was that China posed both challenges and opportunities. I, for one, hope that NATO will not abandon the notion of opportunities to work together with China. But I know that the challenges will be heavy on everyone's mind in the NATO strategic concept process, and we'll see where they come out on that. But one final, just I think, interesting factor right now is that NATO discourse with China and dialogue with China is healthier than it is with Russia. The NATO-Russia Council is moribund now. It's been cut off by Russia, and Russia has withdrawn its mission from NATO, kicked NATO out of Moscow. The NATO office in Moscow had to close. So there's no dialogue open with Russia between NATO and Russia right at the moment. But there is, interestingly, dialogue with Beijing. While I was DSG, we put in place a really solid political military dialogue between NATO headquarters and Beijing. By the way, the last topic for that dialogue was arms control. So isn't it ironic that NATO and China are discussing arms control when others haven't had a chance to do that?
Right, great. All right, so there are a couple of questions about how a U.S.-China risk reduction arms control dialogue can move forward. And I want to get to those and ask each of you to address those. I just want to also remind everybody that the morning after the Biden-Xi virtual summit, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan did confirm that President Biden raised the issue of the need for a strategic stability set of conversations. And then he said, it is now incumbent upon us to think about how the most productive way to carry it forward from here would be. And there's been some reporting about citing Chinese officials that this could involve track 2 discussions. It could involve track 1.5. Just really quickly, given where things are at the moment, let me just ask Lynn and Rose, what is ideally the right framework for carrying this forward? Which persons in government need to be involved? What might briefly the scope of the issues be? And then I have a follow-up question about something you mentioned, Rose, the P5 meeting happening later this month. But Lynn and Rose, on that specific question, to kind of try to answer Jake Sullivan's question about thinking about the most productive way to carry that dialogue forward.
Did you want to go first, Rose, or? Well, I think, the point he made that it has to be leader directed and done at a senior level, or at least directed at a senior level, I think is a very important point. At the same time, I think it can't only be there. I think there's an important for risk reduction, there really needs to be stronger mill-to-mill channels of communication. But I also think in the past, a lot of it at these very senior level, at the foreign minister and the minister of defense level, or the deputies under them, where they do these joint talks, they have long agendas where the sort of proliferation, strategic stability, arms control stuff is like item number 10, and there's only one person in the room who's really expert in that, where they speak, and they speak very, they don't have a lot of time to go into depth. And so I think that we're going to have to evolve to a point where you've got more of the, expert military and civilian people in the room having a dialogue, the way we do with Russia. But it's going to take a while to get there. And again, I think the focus needs to be on, risk reduction, practical confidence building measures before you get to anything like arms control.
Rose?
Well, I just want to recollect the number, I mentioned them during my remarks, the number of venues that we had active during the Obama administration. And I think looking back to that experience and thinking, I'm sure plenty of the people who are inside the administration now have recollections of how those were conducted and who conducted them. But it was, as Lynn said, it ranged from the high level down to, and I think this was especially valuable, military to military level. I remember there were military to military strategic stability talks that the Pentagon conducted with Chinese counterparts. And every year or so, a group of about 25 really smart Chinese military officers would come over to the Department of State, and they would sit down with me as Undersecretary for Arms Control and pepper me with questions for 2 to 3 hours. And it was, of course, you say, okay, they were giving, they were just getting, but by answering questions, as you well know, you can deliver a lot of messages. And so I think it was an important exchange of information, and I hope really helped to inform thinking inside the PLA, not only, of course, my intervention with them, but their time at the Pentagon, because most of the time was spent at the Pentagon in military to military discussions. So that's one venue I do think we should look at. A second, there was an undersecretary level dialogue. I had one with my counterpart in the Chinese Foreign Ministry. I think that was valuable. We covered a lot of bread and butter issues to do with arms control, but of course also non-proliferation cooperation. But the third level, and this gets to a very high level of government, we had a cabinet level exchange that was part of a commission. A number of cabinet secretaries were involved in this commission, but I remember very well sitting down with Ernie Moniz when he was the Secretary of Energy in meetings with Chinese counterparts, and talking about nuclear security and radiological security and ways we could work together to improve that. And by the way, I do understand that the Chinese are very much enthusiastic about nuclear counterterrorism as a topic that is valuable and kind of readily available. The political overhang there is not so strong as in some other areas, such as trying to demand that they enter into the New START negotiations, the follow-on negotiations to New START, by way of example of a set of questions that they don't want to have to wrestle with. And indeed, as Lynn recounted, and I also underscored, it's not really appropriate at this moment because their nuclear arsenal is so much smaller than that of the United States and Russia. So I think there are some examples of how we could go about it, and maybe some of the subject matter that would open some doors to broader substantive discussions of nuclear matters with them.
Great. All right. That's very insightful. Thank you. All right. We have a number of questions that are kind of hardware oriented, hypersonics and software diplomacy questions. I'm going to try to get to all of these. But next one is just kind of following up on kind of next diplomatic steps. A few questions about the upcoming, how the upcoming NPT Review Conference and other multilateral fora and allies can help encourage a dialogue between the US and China, reduce risks between the two countries, and promote strategic stability. Alicia Sanders-Zachary, one of my former colleagues here now with ICANN in Geneva, is asking how the NPT states parties can contribute at the review conference next month. So if Lynn and Rose, you could prescribe a bit rather than wonder, what should that conference do to help promote the right kinds of next steps? Relatedly, Rose, you mentioned that the P5 process, which is been going on since 2007, you've been part of those discussions in the past with kind of deputy foreign ministerial undersecretary level. That is happening on, I think it's December 2nd, 3rd in Paris. I mean, do you believe that conference could or should, or that meeting could or should try to expand upon the statement that Presidents Biden and Putin agreed to at their summit, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought? Might that be one way to, ease the U.S.-China dialogue along? So let me ask you guys to react to some of that, offer your thoughts, Lynn and Rose, and then we'll get to some of the hardware questions that Jerry can perhaps answer.
Go ahead,
sorry.
Lynn.
Yeah. You want to go first on the P5, and then I'll add.
Okay, all right. I will just quickly say, Daryl, I absolutely believe that there should be a restatement of the Reagan-Gorbachev declaration as made by Biden and Putin last June in their summit meeting. By the P5, I know that there's been some debate and discussion among the P5 about this matter over the last few years. So we'll see where other P5 members come down. But to my mind, that's going to be a very important going in policy document for the NPT nuclear weapon states to have for the review conference. And aside from that, I do think how the P5 express their continuing commitment to the disarmament pillar of the NPT is going to be really important, and perhaps will take the Chinese out of their comfort zone, because I do believe they will be under some pressure in the NPT context. And they've always been participants in the NPT context as nuclear weapon states since their advent as a nuclear weapon state. So they need, I think, to figure out from a foreign policy perspective how they are going to really talk about their emerging nuclear modernization in this particular setting. At the moment, I can't foresee how they will do that, except that they may just continue to insist that nothing has changed, but it really strains credulity if they decide to go down that path. I do think they're going to have to address some of these major questions that have come up.
I agree with that. Everything Rose just said out loud on two points. One, on the Reagan-Gorbachev, I hope that there is a reaffirmation by the five. It would be unfortunate if it then has, 3 paragraphs of Talmudic interpretation that water down the impact of the simple statement, which is really irrefutable, that a nuclear war can't be won and shouldn't be fought. So I hope that they will work out a statement that will have a positive impact at the RevCon. More broadly at NTI, we've got a project related to the RevCon, and we just came out with a paper with practical, recommendations on practical and achievable steps that could be achieved. And it has a whole set of ideas of things that the P5 can do together in terms of commitment between now and the next RevCon on nuclear risk reduction, doctrine, and some of it reporting, and some of that involves more interaction with the non-nuclear weapon states to undertake commitments and then report back in the years between the RevCons about what they're actually doing, what practical steps they're taking, that kind of thing. So I think there is a lot more the P5 can do together, and they should, but I also think there's a lot of work to be done in bilateral channels. All
right, thank you. And I would just quickly add that I think the United States has a lot to do to try to make this conference successful. It is a pandemic delayed conference. It was supposed to happen a year and a half ago. There is a bit of a diplomatic rush to try to get things together. It's beginning very soon. And the United States has not been too clear about what its goals and priorities are, in part because the nuclear posture review is not complete. So all of the P5 will have, I think, a difficult story to tell regarding their commitments under Article 6 of the NPT on disarmament. And it will be important for the United States to, as best it can, to set itself apart from the other guys, so that it doesn't look like all the P5 are all doing the same unhelpful things with respect to nuclear arms racing. So let me come back to a couple of the hardware questions that are popping up here. And Gerald, I wanted to ask you to weigh in with this and give you a chance to say something about what General Mark Milley said a few days ago. We have a question from Michael Keller noting that Milley described the recent Chinese hypersonic missile test as very close to a Sputnik moment. Rose was saying we shouldn't panic. We should be patient. Is that hypersonic weapon a first strike weapon, as some officials are implying? What is your take on the technical capabilities that particular test demonstrated? And I would just note that that's not China's first hypersonic missile test. The U.S. and Russia are developing similar systems. And there's a very good report that my colleague Shannon Bugos put together on hypersonic weapons, a very good primer that's on the Arms Control Association website. But I mean, tell us, Jerry, whether this is a Sputnik moment? Is this a reason to kind of rethink what China is trying to do, or what its capabilities are?
Yeah, so I think probably not, right? Hypersonic weapon. I mean, the big difference with the fractional orbital bombardment system is that it goes the other way. All right, either way, you're still going to get hit with a nuclear weapon. I don't think I really care that much about which direction it came from if something's coming raining down like that. So I wouldn't
South Pole versus North Pole when you say the other direction.
Exactly. Okay. So yeah, so I think that can be very much overstated. It is still a development that can diversify. I think the qualitative factors do matter, but I would not really classify it as something as close to that or as a game changer that really changes the U.S. approach to anything. The more concerning to me would be, for instance, development of regional weapons, DF-21 and DF-26 that I mentioned, that more accurate, precise, potentially like theater-capable weapons. Things along those lines concern me a lot more than that. As far as hypersonic weapons in general, that you mentioned, there's also large increase in deployments recently of DF-17s, which are, again, regional, right, which may or may not be nuclear capable. That had not really been made clear yet. I think more likely the conventional side is a little more important there. But hypersonic weapon on its own, more maneuverable but slower than a ballistic missile. I don't see it as being that much of a game changer in this context.
All right. Any other thoughts, Lynn or Rose, on how the hypersonic missile tests are affecting the overall equation? All right. So let's see. I wanted to head over to a couple of questions about, where was it? This is another question for Jerry. And this gets into reading between the lines of the Chinese government statements. How much do we believe the recent Chinese actions, the buildup of nuclear capabilities, is related to Xi Jinping's personal leadership approach? How much of this is coming from the system? How can we better understand that as we go forward here? What is your take?
So I think that there is definitely a large component that precedes Xi Jinping on this, but there's also definitely a large component of General Secretary Xi's personal leadership, right? Primarily, I would point out in 2015, there were some very, very drastic changes in the People's Liberation Army. They restructured entirely from military regions into a joint theater command system that was really oriented towards fighting these local wars in a far more effective manner than was previously capable. The Strategic Support Force was developed, which governs like cyber, space, things along those lines, as well as the Joint Logistics Force. And more importantly, to our piece here, the 2nd Artillery was amplified to an entirely unique military service, the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, with Xi Jinping specifically stating that you need to expand the number of strategic systems and really diversify within this. So there's really just along the PLA modernization has changed substantially under Xi Jinping's leadership, as well as a lot of just domestic side things within the People's Republic of China. So I don't think you can discount that factor, and I think that matters substantially.
All right. Great. And let me just, since we were talking about Reagan and Gorbachev, I'm jumping around here, I'm sorry. One of our colleagues notes that the Reagan-Gorbachev statement from 1985 was, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And recognizing that any conflict inviting nuclear weapons could have catastrophic consequences, we emphasize the importance of preventing any war between nuclear armed states, and we commit not to seek military superiority. So that's an important reminder about where things were in 1985, and that just brings me to another question about the overall U.S. Approach to confronting China and countering China. And this is a question for Rose. How important is it that U.S. policymakers are careful not to suggest that the United States is seeking to dominate or win or seek superiority vis-a-vis China militarily, particularly in the nuclear sphere. I mean, what is your take as a diplomat dealing with the Russians? How does that language change the conversation and lead to a different response from the people across the table?
Well, I think Lynn in her remarks had some wise suggestions about what could come out of the NPR process, such as a statement that U.S. missile defenses are not designed to undermine the Chinese strategic nuclear deterrent. That's a statement we've been willing to make with regard to Russia and its strategic nuclear deterrent. So that I think is an interesting and wise approach to take. I do want to say, though, that we talk about diplomacy, and I think about diplomacy as being part of our integrated deterrence spectrum, right? We have our military means at one end of the spectrum, and at the other end, we have our means at the negotiating table. But these are not all about being nice to the other side. They are also about sending some tough messages to the other side and making sure through our interactions that we are crystal clear about our red lines, about the concerns that we have with developments in China, et cetera. So I just want to emphasize, because people often think, oh, arms control diplomacy, it means it's all like cuddly and fun, but actually it's not at all cuddly and fun. You have to use those interactions in order to also convey tough messages and make sure that you are being clear about your red lines. So in the end of the day, diplomacy and having that as part of your toolkit is all about being able to change the status quo without reverting to the use of force. And that has to be an important part of US foreign policy, period. And I didn't come up with that. I want to give full credit to my former colleague, Jamie Shea at NATO, who used that, I think, as a very telling image in his frequent lectures about NATO and its deterrence and defense plus dialogue policy toward the Soviet Union and now toward Russia. Well, as I said, unfortunately, the dialogue's a little short at the moment with Russia. But if you hope not to have to revert to the use of military force, you have to use diplomatic instruments to the hilt. And it is part and has to be a part of our integrated deterrence strategy.
Thanks. Thank you. So we have a question from Marina Kostic regarding Russia's role in bringing China into the nuclear disarmament arms control enterprise. As we all know, the Trump administration, late in its time, realized that there were perhaps arms control opportunities out there, but it got late to the party, and it pursued a trilateral initiative involving the U.S. and Russia and China that did not take off. So I'm not asking you guys to comment on that per se, but clearly, Russia has a role in the broader nuclear disarmament dialogue, and also this is maybe a question for any one of the three of you. What might Russia's concerns be about from a defense military deterrent standpoint about what China may be doing with its arsenal? They are next door neighbors themselves. So, what positive role possibly could Russia play in helping to bring China into the disarmament dialogue, and what might Russia's own concerns be about China's activities? I'll learn my lesson. I'll start with Lynn, and then we'll go to Rose and Jerry.
Well, it's worth recalling that Russia for a long time has taken the position that for deeper reductions, they're not prepared to do it bilaterally. We would need to bring in other parties. And of course, when they say that, they're talking about explicitly about the UK and France, but they may also be thinking about China. But I think that does mean that if we get to a point of a multilateral negotiation, it's probably going to be P5, not just with China. And, you know, you can start with something like maybe if the US and Russia are still at much higher levels, can you get political commitments from the other three not to exceed certain levels? Although that just got harder given what we just heard about China's potential expansion, because that ceiling then could be a lot higher than when the other three were near each other. You know, or, I mean, the irony is, to some extent, when we've always talked about the longer term goal of multilateral, five-party, implicitly that always meant parity, but we never talk about it. And now that we're at the moment of thinking that we might have to concede Chinese parity at some point, you know, it's obviously hard in our political discourse to talk about that. And I will point out that that's a big difference between in the Reagan-Gorbachev era when we were talking about two essentially equal powers with nuclear capability. I mean, we're the ones that have vast superiority over China at the moment, but I would still submit that they have an assured destruction. You know, there's mutual vulnerability even now.
Just picking up on Lynn's comment about having a certain assumption of parity, I noticed one of the questioners asked about my recent piece in the Texas National Security Review, The Standstill Conundrum. I actually think where the diplomatic space may be for work among the P5 is in preserving the viability of and escaping upcoming vulnerability for second strike deterrent forces. So that may be an area, it's certainly an area I intend to explore further as a possible venue for worthwhile and fairly early, although here too, I think we have time. We're not facing immediate vulnerability of second strike deterrent forces, but I do think it's a problem for perhaps 20 or 30 years from now. So there could be different ways of thinking about scoping diplomatic interaction on this set of nuclear stability issues, but I just would like to put that on the table and welcome actually further remarks and reactions from the audience in thinking about this, not at this event perhaps, but as we move forward. On how the Russians are reacting, it's very interesting to me that the Russians have been very circumspect officially. They do not acknowledge or express any concerns about military developments in China. China is their friend, right? China is their partner. And so they never talk about the potential for needing to target Chinese nuclear systems, for example. It's just not done. But I do note that in talking with a number of Russian experts, they have been quite concerned. I don't think it's too strong to say that their hair is on fire about the same things that we've been reading about, such as the silo construction project and the modernization of Chinese nuclear forces, leading to an integrated triad of nuclear forces. And furthermore, the FOBS test, I think, has raised eyebrows among the Russian expert community as well. But I do not expect to see official concerns expressed. It's just not going to happen.
All right, thank you. So, Jerry, any thoughts about how the Russians are perceiving the Chinese military nuclear buildup and how it may actually materially affect them or not?
I think that Rose pretty much covered it there.
Okay.
You don't see a lot of vocal or public things on either side, right? A Russian or Chinese within that regard. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I think it's often not public in that manner.
Okay. All right. I want to come to a question that's come up in a few ways from the audience and came up in the opening remarks. Relating to declaratory policy, the US decisions about that issue, President Biden's decisions, and China's own declared no first use policy, and how that might be a mechanism for lowering tensions. And I just want to remind everybody that this is one of the key issues in the nuclear posture review. President Biden has expressed some pretty clear views on this subject. He said in 2020 during the campaign that the sole purpose of the U.S. arsenal should be deterring and, if necessary, retaliating against a nuclear attack, unquote, and he will, quote, work to put that belief into practice. China has long had a no first use policy. There are some questions about whether, how credible that is, given what it is doing. But I'd just like to ask, Lynn and Rose in particular to comment on how a shift towards a sole purpose policy by President Biden might ease tensions and lower the temperature and provide perhaps a mechanism by which the two sides can have deeper conversations about nuclear declaratory policy. I mean, Lynn, you brought this up a little bit. Just how do these two things relate?
I mean, I think we should be, as the president said, as a candidate and earlier, be working toward and embracing a sole purpose policy and working with our allies to move in that direction. And the reason I think it because I don't see a circumstance where it's in the U.S. interest to be the initiator of nuclear use. I don't see that enhancing our security or that of our allies. But the working with allies part is really important. And I don't feel like I haven't seen evidence that the administration has used the time from the beginning of the administration to now to clearly state that that was the direction we wanted to go in, and working with them to get them comfortable, which can include talking about conventional, when and how we get there and what conventional enhancements, are needed, and how do we provide the reassurance. And so I think that work still needs to be done. And we're now clearly in an environment where allies are painting on a blank canvas to, and of course, allies aren't uniform position, but as Rosa's just reported and made more on what she's hearing in Asia, I was thinking, primarily in Europe as well. So, I mean, I think we really need to be more focused than we are on reducing the risk of nuclear use, which that risk is growing. It's growing partly because of an incredible amount of complacency about it. It's growing because of things like cyber risk to nuclear command and control. It's growing because of, what's happening with China and tensions in the region. And so I think that really should be the focus of US policy. And we ought to be thinking about how to advance that. I think a declaratory policy, that reduces the circumstances under which we would threaten nuclear use makes sense and actually makes deterrence more credible, and also relies heavily on the part of our deterrent that is essential, which is our huge conventional capacity to defend allies and ourselves and deter another country from going nuclear, which is what we need to avoid.
Rose, any thoughts on that?
I don't have anything to add, Daryl, given my earlier comments. So
okay. Thanks. All right. I want to try to get to two more questions before we close things off. And this one's for Jerry. And, Lynn brought up the issue of missile defense being a factor in the US-China equation. The offense-defense relationship has always been part of the nuclear balance between the US and the Soviets and the Russians. So I just wanted to ask you specifically, Gerald, how you assess China is looking at US strategic missile capabilities. I would note, and how that might be a factor in what it is doing. I would note that November, the United States, for the first time, conducted a flight test of an SM-3 Block 2A Aegis missile interceptor against a strategic target for the first time. So a theater range interceptor against a strategic target, ship-based. So in your view, how much of a factor is that, and in China's thinking? And to Rose and Lynn, what can the United States do beyond, and I think you mentioned this, Lynn, a reiteration, a rhetorical expression that, our missile defense capabilities are not designed to counter Russian or Chinese, strategic retaliatory capabilities.
Yeah, so I definitely think it's a factor. We've seen through a variety of track 1.5 and track 2 talks discussing with Chinese officials, through internal writings on the matter. There's a variety of sources kind of highlighting that they are very concerned about the way that missile defenses affect their retaliatory capability. I don't think that that's very easily disputable, that they have been reacting in some portion due to that. I don't think that that's the only factor by any means, though. There's a variety of different things that kind of feed into this collective equation. I don't think that if we unilaterally just get rid of all missile defenses, then suddenly everything's going to get much better, especially at the point where we are now. But it's definitely the factor that feeds into their assessment of vulnerability and is kind of changing their threat perception.
Right, and Rosalind, the diplomatic tightrope. What can be done in order to help better assuage, if that is really helpful, their concerns about U.S. strategic capabilities.
I'd say two things in terms of missile defense. I mean, one is it shouldn't just be a statement. It should be a statement that is then implemented through, what missile defenses we pursue and how many and capability and that kind of thing. But in the Asia Pacific, of course, this just goes to show how much it's a regional issue and dynamic, and that goes true for strategic stability and any consideration of arms control down the road. Because, some of what we're doing that worries China is not driven by China, or not only by China, but it's driven by North Korea. And so there's a whole, regional security equation that has to be addressed. I think it can't be done piecemeal.
I agree.
Rose, you've dealt with this issue a few times before, I'm sure.
I just wanted to add, it is a regional security issue, and it always is for the United States. That's why we keep insisting that our missile defense system is directed at limited threats from regional actors, either Iran or North Korea, and nobody believes us. At least the Russians and the Chinese don't believe us. And they say we're heading in the direction of a comprehensive national missile defense system to defend the United States. They always refer back. I'm stunned to this day that they always refer back to the Ronald Reagan Star Wars program from 1983, and they are just convinced that we are heading in that direction. But it's that conviction and the way that they have pressed it on us at the negotiating table that I think has really allowed a good deal, at least in Russia's case, a good deal of missile defense modernization and technology development to go on under the cover of their offensive. I mean this in the diplomatic sense, their diplomatic offensive against us, that we should limit our missile defenses. So I've certainly been urging that the administration in the strategic stability talks with Russia insists that Russian missile defense developments also be on the table, that their development and deployment of the S-500 is a great example of how far their missile defense technology has come in the intervening years, and that we need to talk about their systems as much as they want to talk about our systems. So perhaps, and I do understand that in the working group discussions so far that this issue has been put on the table by the US side. So perhaps we can have some kind of beneficial then influence on discussions with China also about missile defenses if the United States and Russia are talking about mutual confidence building, mutual transparency measures with regard to our missile defense developments on both sides. Perhaps this can help inform then discussions with China about missile defense. We will see. But there's an example where there could be a beneficial feedback loop from the US-Russia strategic stability dialogue to the China-US strategic stability dialogue. I'm always an optimist, Daryl, so I'll end on that optimistic note.
That's a good note to end on. We are out of time, everyone. And I just wanted to say that there's a good question that's in the Q&A that we're going to save for the next webinar that the Arms Control Association organizes, because it's a tough one that requires exploration, which is how the United States government, particularly the Biden administration, can reassure the international community that it will continue to pursue an approach vis-a-vis China on arms control, Russia on nuclear arms control that's not subject to the recent swings in presidential administrations. And that is an ongoing challenge that I don't think we can answer in the remaining 3 minutes we have. But I just wanted to note that that's on the table for future discussion. So with that, I want to thank very much Rose Gottemoeller and Lynn Ruston and Gerald Brown for their excellent insights and presentations, your hard work on these issues. And I want to thank everybody in the audience. We had a big crowd today. I tried to get to as many questions as we can. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to yours. This will not be the last discussion that we organize on the subject of US-China arms control and risk reduction issues. You can be rest assured this will be something we'll all be grappling with for some time to come. And as Rose said, we need to be patient. I would add persistent, and we need to be pragmatic. So thank you very much. Let me just note that we will be posting a recording of this event on our website, www.armscontrol.org, in 2 or 3 days, at the latest on Monday, for your viewing enjoyment. If you can't find something on Netflix, I can always suggest the videos on the Arms Control website. And if you appreciate events like this and appreciate the information that we provide and the articles we publish in Arms Control today, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we depend on member support. Consider becoming a member or just signing up to our alerts and updates that we provide to thousands of people. So thank you, everyone, for your attention. Thanks to our panelists once again, and we are adjourned. Good day.